Hey folks, welcome to Moonshift Audio. The range of free plugins out there is getting better and better, and for this week's video I decided to put some of them to the test in a direct comparison against some of the paid plugins that I use every day. I pulled up a vocal chain that I used in a recent mixdown, and I decided to see if I could recreate the exact same chain using plugins that are completely free. Although some of the free alternatives didn't have quite the same mojo as the paid versions, by the end of the chain I was pretty impressed with the results I was able to get. I put out a new video every week, so please do like and subscribe. For now, let's jump into Cubase and compare these plugins.
Okay, so I've got the vocal here from a recent collaboration I did with Kinoko, a Tokyo-based artist. I've actually got a full video where I go through the production and another one where I go through the mix of the entire track for this. But for this video, I've just bounced out the instrumental and a section of the lead vocal. And I've got my vocal chain here. You can see on the left, I've got a Pro EQ4, a couple of UAD compressors. Then we get into some EQs, some harmonics, and a bit of excitement from Fresh Air and a Soothe, which I'm using as a de-esser. And down here in blue, I've got my attempt to recreate that same vocal sound using an entirely free set of plugins. All of the plugins are completely free here. Now, I go through this vocal chain in quite a lot of depth in the mixdown video for Need to Know. So I'm not going to get too deep into that for this video, but I am going to go through the plugins one by one. So the first thing I'm going to do is bypass everything I've got here. And I've done the same on the other chain of free plugins. I'm also going to bypass the send effects, so we should end up with a completely dry vocal.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light, ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Now, this was really nicely recorded by Kinoko, so there's not like loads and loads of treatment that we need to do before we start, but there is some low frequency energy in there that perhaps I probably would look to scoop out, which is why the first plugin in my paid chain is a Pro EQ4, and you can see I'm scooping out some mud here, about 450 Hz, 442 to be exact, and I'm rolling off the lows. And if we listen to it with that engaged,
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light, ready to leave it all behind in a city.
and without,
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light,
you can just hear that sort of
ready to
muddy
leave
resonance
it all
down there.
behind in a city.
So, for a free EQ, you can't do much better than Nova by Tokyo Dawn Records. Really highly recommend this one. The free version only comes with 4 bands, but that's often enough, certainly in this case. And you can always stack 2 one after the other if you need more bands. I've basically duplicated the exact same settings. So I've got one band at 442 Hz, minus 7.7 dBs, with a Q of 1.778. So if we look at here, minus 7.7, 442 Hz, same Q factor. Similarly, for the low shelf, that's at 53 Hz, taking off neg 30 out of the Q of 0.53, 53 Hz. The gain actually doesn't go lower than neg 18 on this, so that's an immediate difference. And the Q's the same. So we can hear, this is the Pro EQ4.
Behind in a city, ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind.
And you can hear there is still
ready to leave it
a bit more low end energy in this. So the
ready to leave it all behind in a city.
the EQs aren't performing exactly the same.
Leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
I'd say that's certainly close enough at this stage. This is just some gentle scooping. But it is interesting that you have to work the EQs differently. You might expect them to behave in almost exactly the same way. Next plugin in my paid chain is the classic 1176 from Universal Audio. And I'm not doing loads with this.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind.
Just taking off
in a city. Ready to leave it all behind.
dB or so on the peaks there. For a free equivalent, I've got Fetish, which is an excellent plugin by Analog Obsession. If you're not familiar with Analog Obsession plugins, then I highly recommend them. They're all made by a chap called Ridvan. He gives them away for free, and they're pretty damn good, I'd say. He has a Patreon page. You can support him on that. I'm sure he'd really appreciate any support because he does this out of the goodness of his own heart. Let's see how this one sounds.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
And this is pretty much as I expected. You know, I'm only tickling this, so I don't think we're going to be hearing huge, great differences in the actual compression that's taking place here. But we are going to start hearing potentially differences in the saturation. A big part of what these plugins model is the saturation that these hardware units impart on the signal. And certainly in the UAD version, I can hear a brightening, a bit of excitement going on there.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all.
So this is without the plugin.
Ready to leave it
just that real high-end air. It's just getting excited a bit. Whereas with the free fetish plugin, I'm just not hearing that brightness.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Now, although I really like the saturation and character that you get from these UAD compressors, it's not the end of the world if it's not there, because we can always compensate by adding a bit more saturation later on. So I'm going to move on to the next plugin in the chain, which is the Silverface LA2A.
Ready to leave it all.
And this is what I'm using to do
Ready to leave it all behind
the majority of
in
the
a
sort of
city.
heavy lifting compression.
Ready to leave it all
Really leveling it out.
behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
So you can hear that's just sort of holding that vocal in place nicely, and it's adding even more of that beautiful kind of like high-end saturation, which I really like, particularly from the LA2A. The free equivalent is another great plugin from Analog Obsession, and it's Lala. So I'll bring that in.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Perhaps go a bit harder on that.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind
And I'll
in
bypass
a
it.
city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Now, with this one, I can actually hear a little bit of that air being added, that sort of slight sizzly saturation that I just love from an LA2A. So I'd say this is doing a really great job. But if we compare the paid chain at this point,
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind
you can
in
hear
a
that
city.
excitement
Ready to leave it all
that I'm hearing here
behind in a city.
on the breath, the air.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave
Just isn't
it
there
all behind in
to
a
the same
city.
extent on the free
Ready
chain.
to leave it all.
Next up in my paid vocal chain, the one that I've used for the mix down, I've got a Pultec EQ, and that's literally just doing a 2 dB boost at 8K. We can take a quick listen to that. So this is
Leave it
without.
all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it
Just
all
adding some of that
behind in a
high-end
city.
presence. For a free version, this is another Analog Obsession plugin. He really has done all the classics. Let's take a listen to this. So this is without.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind.
Again, just
in
2
a
dBs
city.
here.
Ready to leave
At
it all
8K.
behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Going back to the
Ready
paid
to
chain.
leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Just feel like, again, it's the saturation that isn't quite coming through that I am used to getting from these UAD emulations. We'll see how that pans out further down the chain. Next up, and this is quite a big one for me, this is the Maag EQ, and I really do love this plugin. If we hear it without
Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
and with.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
So what I've got here is
Ready to leave it
1.5
all
dBs
behind in a
on the
city.
2.5K
Ready
shelf
to leave it all behind
and
in a
5
city.
dBs
Ready to leave
in the
it
air
all
band, which
behind
isn't quite
in a
turned on yet, so
city.
I'm going to switch that on.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
And there's that
Ready to
beautiful
leave it all
airy
behind in
pop
a
sparkle
city.
on the top.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all
Without.
behind in a city. ready to leave it all behind in a city.
That's your pop sizzle right there. Now, I couldn't find a direct free equivalent to this, but you can get some way into this by just using a normal EQ. So I'll turn off the airband again, and I've got another instance of Nova here. I've set the exact same thing, so I've got a 1.5 dB boost at 2.5K on a high shelf. You can hear that without.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
It's not
ready to leave it all
quite such a pronounced
in a
difference.
City. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind
as with the Maag.
Ready to leave
So I
it
might
all
be inclined to
behind in a
increase that
city.
shelf boost
Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
to try and get a little bit more of the same effect. It may be that there's saturation happening under the bonnet of this Maag EQ as well. For the airband, I've just got another high shelf at 40K, which is exactly where this one was set. And if I put 5 dBs in there, let's see what we get.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Compared to the Maag.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
A bit louder, so I'm just going to pull back the trim here.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
I'd say that's not bad. We're definitely getting that lovely air on the top there.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Next up in my paid chain, I'm just doing a tiny bit more work with a Pro EQ4. You can see I'm just scooping out a couple of dBs, 1.5 dBs of mud there at 343 Hertz. And I've got a dynamic band in the lows at 174.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Just thinning that vocal out a little bit more. This is something that came later when I was actually putting this in the mix. There was a bit of build up there. Now, as luck would have it, Nova does have a dynamic band, so I've just created these same two moves here.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it
And just here, just that little bit of sort of low end resonance being removed there. I'd say that's doing a great job.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Harmonics wise, I was using the soft tube harmonics for the actual mix down, and you should hear it if I bypass this.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in
Just kind of softens it a bit,
ready to leave it all
roughs it up ever so slightly. For a free version, I love the saturation knob by Softube. The only slight issue is that I can turn that up and the knob doesn't move. Not quite sure at what point that broke, but you can hear that's definitely on. But it does encourage us to use our ears, so we'll do just that. We'll just pull this in.
Leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
It's a different character that this saturation's brought, but actually I really like it. I almost prefer it to the saturation station there. Next in each chain, we've got Fresh Air, which is a free plugin anyway. You can see that I used it not at all on the high end and 6% on the lows. And we can do exactly the same thing on the free chain. Here's the paid version.
City. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave
just adding a little bit of sparkle on there, a bit of air.
Ready to leave it all
and we'll go to the paid, the free chain.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
You know, in a mix you might decide this isn't actually so necessary because the previous saturator has added quite a lot of that high-end air. The last plugin that I was using was Soothe, and I was using that as a de-esser in the paid mix.
Leave it all behind in a city. ready to leave it all.
And for a free version, I found this free TD-esser from Techivation, and I actually really like it. I set the quality on Ultra. I think that's like upsampling basically. I bring that in.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all
Just listen to the S
behind in a city.
on City.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave
Really
it all
smooth.
behind in a city. Ready.
So if we compare those two vocals, they are different.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
I think perhaps I might be inclined to go back in and tweak some of the EQ on this one, but we can hear it. I'll enable the sound effects and I'll unmute the instrumental. This is at quite a low level, and we can just take a quick listen to these in the context of the mix. So here's the paid plugin chain.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Lost in memory. Hand out trying to hedge a ride. Diamonds on the edge of your eyes, lines are blurry. Are you with me?
And this time we'll hear the free chain.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Perhaps a tiny bit too much in the high end here.
Hand out trying to hedge a ride. Diamonds on the edge of your eyes, lines are blurry. Are you with me?
So definitely not identical there, but I'd say that the free plugin chain is performing really well, and I wouldn't have a problem making a mix using just those. And you know, when I think about the thousands of pounds that I spent on these, you know, I paid, I think, £300 for the 1176 collection, £200 for the LA2A, 50 quid for the Maag Pro Q, I think it was 120 quid. Harmonics, I think I got on sale. Soothe is not a cheap plugin. You know, it really does add up, and actually the value that you get out of an entirely free plugin chain is quite impressive.
That's it for this week. Please do like and subscribe for more tips, tricks, resources and downloads from me at Moonshift Audio. Till next time.